I never believed in the so-called snowman until I came face to face with him. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, and even now I still wake drenched in sweat when the memory drags me back. My name doesn't matter, but what does is that I've been a park ranger for 15 years. I've dealt with grizzlies, cougars, wolves, every creature that can make your blood run cold out there. But nothing, not one encounter, prepared me for what waited in those woods. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning at the end of September. The leaves had just started to shift color, and I was looking forward to the quiet stretch before winter. My supervisor called around 7, far earlier than usual, and I could tell instantly something was wrong. His voice was tight, controlled, the kind that hides panic behind authority. He said there was a special assignment, highly confidential, triple pay, triple. That should have been my first warning sign, but my truck had broken down the week before. The repairs had gutted my savings, and my daughter's college fund was hanging by a thread. I told myself it was just a dangerous animal case, a rogue bear, a puma killing livestock, and some big money landowner wanted it handled quietly. He refused to explain more on the phone, only told me to meet at the ranger station at 6 the next morning, and not to speak a word about it to anyone, not even my wife. I barely slept that night. The silence in the house was heavy, as if something already knew what was coming. When I pulled into the station before dawn, a black pickup was waiting in the lot, engine idling. Steam curled from the exhaust in the cold air. 3 men sat in the back wrapped in thick jackets. I recognized 2, rangers from neighboring zones, good men, steady hands. The third was a stranger, but he had that hardened, sleepless look of someone who spends too much time in wild country. No one spoke. We climbed into the bed of the truck without question. The air tasted metallic, like frozen sap and exhaust fumes. The driver didn't say a word either. He just shifted gears, and we rolled out toward the mountains. For the first 20 minutes, I recognized the roads, routes I'd taken 100 times. Then the truck veered onto a narrow service trail I'd never seen on any map. The forest closed around us like a throat, branches scraping the sides of the vehicle. The path was barely 2 tire ruts in the mud, and every rock we hit jarred my bones. Around 40 minutes in, the passenger in front turned to face us. That's when I realized he wasn't one of us. He wore a black suit and polished shoes that looked ridiculous out there. His tie was perfectly knotted, his hair combed tight, like he'd stepped out of an office minutes ago. But his face betrayed him. He was pale, sweating despite the cold. His eyes had the tremor of someone who'd seen something he couldn't process. When he spoke, his voice cracked. He told us we'd be paid more than we'd ever earned for one job, but we were forbidden to talk about what we'd see. Ever. The situation was classified, he said. If information leaked, there'd be serious consequences. He didn't say what kind, but fear dripped from his words. It wasn't a threat. It was a confession. No one asked questions. The silence in that truck grew heavier than the gear we carried. I kept watching the man in the suit. He kept checking his watch and glancing out the back window toward the woods, like he expected something to follow us. His hands shook when he wiped sweat from his brow, even as our breath came out in clouds. After another hour, we stopped. The place didn't even qualify as a clearing, just a spot where someone had cut enough trees to fit a vehicle. The forest pressed close on every side, dark even in morning light. The man stepped out, opened a leather briefcase that didn't belong anywhere near mud or pine needles, and spread a topographic map on the truck bed. Military-grade detail. He pointed to a spot deep in the wilderness, 8 to 10 miles from where we stood. That would be our base camp. Another mark, 2 miles out from that, was where we'd set the traps. His finger trembled while tracing the routes. He called the target an animal. Large, aggressive, responsible for several tourist attacks. We were to capture it alive if possible. Lethal force was authorized if absolutely necessary. He stressed that it was dangerous beyond normal classification, that we should treat it with extreme caution. When he lifted the tarp covering our equipment, my stomach tightened. These weren't bear traps. They were bear traps made for giants, 3 feet across, steel jaws with teeth 6 inches long, chains thick enough to anchor a ship. I'd never seen anything like them in my career. One of the rangers whistled under his breath. "What the hell are we hunting?" he muttered. The man in the suit hesitated. Then he said, "The species hasn't been identified." He wouldn't meet our eyes. I noticed how carefully he avoided the word bear. We should have left then. Every instinct I had screamed wrong, but the promise of money, the weight of pride, and the unspoken challenge of the unknown kept us moving. We loaded the traps onto our packs, each one easily 60 pounds, and set off into the woods. Within minutes, the forest changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was hollow, like sound itself refused to exist there. No bird calls, no insect buzz. Even our boots felt muffled by the soil. The trees were thicker, their trunks rising like black pillars, their crowns knotting so tightly the daylight turned gray. The air was dense, almost liquid, each breath dragging through unseen weight. Half a mile in, we found the first sign. Torn camping gear scattered through the brush, a shredded backpack hanging from a branch 8 feet high, sleeping bags ripped open, tent poles snapped cleanly. But it wasn't bear work. Bears tear and claw in panic. These cuts were straight, deliberate, as if made by human hands with impossible strength. Then we saw the blood, dark stains dried into bark, some of them 12 feet above the ground. Whatever caused it either stood that tall or threw something that high. One ranger crouched to examine a torn piece of fabric. Heavy mountain cloth, sliced clean through. Not shredded, ripped. He turned it over, and the edges looked cauterized, almost polished by force. None of us spoke. The forest seemed to lean closer around us. Every step forward felt like entering a church for something that didn't want worshippers. An hour later, the smell hit us. Musk, wet fur, and something else, like wool soaked in decay. It crawled up my throat until breathing through my mouth was the only option. Then in a shallow clearing by a stream, we saw the prints. At first, I thought they were human. Then my brain adjusted to the scale. 18 inches long, 8 wide, each toe perfectly defined, heel sunk deep in mud. Too symmetrical for a bear, too heavy for a man. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the clearing, some fresher than others. The stride between steps was 4 feet. Whoever made them had to be enormous. One ranger set his boot beside a print. Size 11 looked like a child's shoe next to it. The ground trembled faintly when we stood still, as if memory itself refused to settle. 2 men decided to leave then and there. They dropped their gear, said no job was worth this. One was expecting his first child. "This isn't wildlife," he said. "This is something else." Watching them disappear down the trail, a part of me wanted to follow. But pride is a cruel leash. I told myself it was just fear-twisting facts. That logic would explain it if we kept moving. It never did. The rest of us, 13 left, kept going. The deeper we walked, the stranger the forest became. Trees cracked off halfway up their trunks, as if something had twisted them. Stones the size of refrigerators were rolled aside, furrows carved where they'd been dragged. The woods grew darker, the light bending before it reached the ground. It felt like the place itself was older than the world around it, untouched since creation. When we finally reached the clearing marked for our camp, it looked too perfect. A wide circle about 50 yards across with a thin stream running along one side. Under other circumstances, it would have been ideal. But surrounded by forest that thick, it felt like standing naked in the center of an eye. We pitched our tents close together, ringed them around a fire pit, pretending proximity could protect us. Every flicker of flame cast new shapes on the trees. I kept catching glimpses of movement that vanished when I turned. My skin prickled constantly, like the forest's breath touched the back of my neck. We built a perimeter alarm, tin cans with stones strung on invisible thread. Primitive, but enough to buy a few seconds warning if something approached. The traps remained unarmed until morning. Even looking at them made my stomach knot. Each jaw gleamed in the firelight, teeth sharp enough to cut bone. As the sun slid behind the peaks, we sat around the fire trading old stories. Bears too curious, moose too territorial, trying to trick ourselves into calm. But the air refused to carry laughter. It soaked it up. When night fell completely, the silence thickened until it felt physical. No owls, no crickets, nothing. I tried to sleep before my watch, but every crackle of the fire pulled me awake. Around midnight, I heard it, the first sound that didn't belong. A low, vibrating call that rolled through the valley like thunder trapped underground. It lasted maybe 10 seconds but shook me to the core. Too deep for any mammal I knew, too deliberate to be wind. 20 minutes later, it came again, from the opposite direction. I gripped my rifle and stayed awake until exhaustion finally dragged me under. The next thing I remember is the explosion of noise at 4:30 a.m. The cans. Every single one rattling at once, a storm of metal echoing through. Dead silence. We burst from our tents, rifles ready, lights cutting through darkness. The sound came from all sides. The lines of string were torn everywhere, cans swinging or flung far into the trees. Some had embedded themselves in trunks 20 feet away. Whatever hit them had strength beyond reason. One ranger swore he heard footsteps, heavy, rhythmic, almost human but too weighted. We formed a ring around the fire, backs inward, guns outward, scanning shadows that seemed to move on their own. No eyeshine, no shapes, just the creeping knowledge that something was out there, aware of us. It watched until dawn. When the first light touched the treetops, we pretended it was over. Pretended courage was still possible. But deep down, we all knew the truth. The forest had woken. and it was waiting. The morning came gray and thin, as if the sun itself was hesitant to rise over that place. No one really spoke. The fire had burned low into black shards of wood, and we just stood there, staring at the tree line, waiting for something to move. The air smelled of wet ash and iron. I could still feel the tremor in my hands every time I tried to pour coffee from the tin cup. It sloshed like my pulse had taken hold of it. The perimeter wires were torn clean in every direction. The strings snapped, the cans bent out of shape like soft foil. Nothing about it looked accidental. It was deliberate, tested, the way a predator circles and taps the fence just to learn how it's built. We geared up to place the traps anyway. It felt insane, walking back into those woods after the night we just had, but no one said it out loud. The silence between us was an agreement. It was surrender. We moved in pairs, lugging the massive steel jaws through undergrowth that seemed to swallow sound again. The forest had returned to that same smothered quiet. It wasn't peace, it was vacancy. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath between the trees. Our first trap site lay about 1.5 miles out, along what the map called an animal path. Only when we reached it I realized how wrong that label was. The trail was far too wide, a corridor 8 feet across where the soil was compacted into a hard pan of prints. Deep impressions, dozens of them, crossing back and forth over years. The trees along either side had their bark peeled off at shoulder height, or at least what would be shoulder height for something 12 feet tall. Whatever used this path had been doing it long enough to carve its own road into the forest. We dug into the earth, buried the trap's base under leaves and mud, disguised the teeth with broken branches. Each hammer strike echoed through the trees like we were knocking on the door of something that didn't want visitors. The steel bit into the soil, groaning as if the ground itself was resisting us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that same towering shadow from my nightmares stepping between the trees. The second sight was worse. The trail there narrowed between 2 slabs of rock, each one taller than a man and smeared with black lichen. But what froze me in place were the carvings. Not scratches, not claw marks, carvings. Circles, lines, symbols I couldn't recognize, etched deep into the stone, as though by something with deliberate strength and purpose. Some looked almost geometric, others crude and ancient, like the memory of a language forgotten long before we walked upright. One of the younger rangers muttered that they reminded him of cave markings he'd seen in anthropology books. But these were fresh. The rock dust still clung to the grooves. We all stood there, staring at those symbols, pretending to be rational men while our hearts hammered with primitive fear. It wasn't just that something huge lived out there. It was that it understood. It had meaning, territory, warning. While setting that second trap, I noticed a new set of prints overlapping ours, fresh, pressed deep into the soft mud. They led right to the spot where we stood, then vanished between the rocks. We hadn't heard a sound. It had come that close, watched us, then left. By early afternoon, the air had turned thick and warm, the kind of heavy stillness that makes you feel like the world's holding a breath you'll eventually have to pay for. When we returned to camp, the forest almost felt normal again. The birds were back. The wind rustled the leaves. For the first time since we'd arrived, someone laughed, a short, nervous sound that broke too quickly. We ate from our tins and convinced ourselves that the quiet meant safety. But deep down, everyone was just waiting for the next noise. It came faster than we expected. A scream tore through the forest. Not human, not animal. It came from the direction of the first trap we'd placed. A long, rising wail that started as a roar and ended like metal tearing in half. We froze mid-bite. For a second, nobody moved. Then instinct kicked in, and we ran. The sound got louder as we pushed through the underbrush, a guttural bellow filled with rage and something else underneath. Pain. I could hear chains rattling, branches snapping, the wet slap of something enormous struggling against the ground. When we reached the clearing, all of us stopped dead. The trap had been sprung, and caught in it was something that shouldn't exist. It towered over the brush, nearly 9 feet tall, even hunched in agony, muscles rippling under dark matted hair. The steel jaws had clamped around its leg just above the ankle, and the thing was trying to pry them apart with its hands. Not paws, hands. Massive, human-like, with black nails thick as horn. Its skin beneath the hair looked gray and leathery, and steam rose from it in the cold air. When it turned its head toward us, the world seemed to tilt. The face was wrong. Too human to be an ape. Too animal to be a man. Deep-set eyes glared through a tangle of brow, intelligent and furious. For a moment, time stuttered. We just stared at each other, both sides realizing the other wasn't supposed to exist. It let out a sound that vibrated in my bones, a howl that wasn't meant for human ears. One of the rangers fired a tranquilizer dart. The needle struck its shoulder, but the creature barely flinched. It looked down, yanked the dart out, and threw it back with a flick of its wrist. The dart embedded itself in a tree beside us, quivering. Another ranger fired, then another. 3 darts, 4, 5. The thing roared again and slammed its fists into the ground so hard I felt the vibration through my boots. Finally, its movement slowed. It staggered, tried to pull the trap once more, then sank to one knee, panting. Even half drugged, its eyes tracked us with something that wasn't confusion. It was understanding, hatred. It took all 13 of us to move it. Even unconscious, it was heavy as a motorcycle, its limbs corded with power that didn't make sense. We used chains meant for machinery, looped them around its wrists and ankles, and still we feared they'd snap. When we rolled it into the steel transport cage, the floor groaned under the weight. The man in the suit had planned this, I realized. The cage wasn't improvised. It was built exactly for this. Every bolt, every latch, every hinge already fitted. By the time we locked it inside, the creature was breathing slowly again, its chest rising like a bellows. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. We could hear the faint click of its claws against the metal floor, as though it was testing the bars even in its sleep. We took turns guarding it that night. I sat my watch beside the veteran ranger who'd been leading us, both of us facing the cage from a safe distance. The firelight made the steel glint in shades of copper. Every few minutes, the creature twitched, murmuring low guttural sounds that didn't sound random. They had rhythm. They had pattern, like words. Around 2 in the morning, the cans outside rattled again. Not all at once this time. In sequence, like something moving around us. Then shadows began to shift beyond the edge of the fire. 3, maybe 4 shapes, massive, walking upright. They moved with uncanny grace for their size, circling just outside the glow of our camp. "There are others," my partner whispered. His voice was barely sound, just air. The shapes didn't charge. They coordinated. You could feel it. The way their movements answered each other. The low hums that vibrated through the ground. Then came the first rock. It whistled through the air and smashed into our fire, scattering coals. Another followed, larger, hitting the supply crate with a crack. Then more. A storm of stones raining from the dark. We scrambled for cover, the air filled with the whoosh of projectiles and the hiss of extinguished flame. They were herding us, testing our reaction. The older ranger shouted for us to hold fire, but panic had already taken over. Someone fired a round into the trees, the muzzle flash lighting a wall of moving silhouettes, thick, towering, shifting with purpose. The barrage lasted nearly an hour. Every impact shook something loose inside me. Not just fear, but a deeper realization. They weren't mindless beasts defending a territory. They were soldiers. Coordinated, intelligent, furious soldiers. And we had taken one of their own. When the attack finally stopped, the forest sank back into stillness. But this time it wasn't empty. It was waiting, watching. The smell of wet iron hung in the air, mixed with smoke and pine. None of us spoke. None of us slept. We just sat there until dawn, each of us silently praying the morning light would come before the next sound. When it did, pale and colorless, our leader called a meeting. He looked 20 years older than the day before. His eyes were red, his voice hollow. "We're done," he said. "We pack up, we leave, we don't come back." No one argued. For the first time in my life, I was relieved to run from something I couldn't understand. We began packing as soon as the light filtered through the trees, each movement slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if rushing might draw their attention again. The morning fog hung low, wrapping the camp in a ghostly shroud that softened every sound. No one spoke much. We all kept glancing toward the cage. Inside, the creature was stirring. Its breaths had grown faster, more deliberate, like a machine powering back on after a shutdown. The sedatives were fading. Its eyes opened while I was coiling the last of the ropes. They locked on me with a clarity that froze me mid-motion. I'd seen animal fear before, raw, instinctive. But this wasn't that. This was calculation. It knew, it understood. The intelligence behind those eyes was human enough to terrify me more than any beast could. The old ranger, our de facto leader, watched too, muttering something that sounded like a prayer. "We're leaving it," he said finally. "No one touches the cage. No one tries to move it." The others nodded quickly, relief thinly veiled behind obedience. But leaving it there felt wrong, like abandoning a storm in a bottle. Every instinct I had screamed that if we walked away, it wouldn't stay where we left it. The veteran walked over to the cage one last time, stood just out of reach of those thick iron bars, and said quietly, "We don't belong here." The creature blinked, slow and deliberate, as if it understood every word. We began the retreat in tight formation. Every creak of a boot, every clank of a chain sounded amplified. The forest swallowed us as soon as we stepped beyond the clearing. For the first mile, nothing followed. No footsteps, no movement, just the heavy silence of a place that wanted to forget we existed. Then came the sounds, distant at first, like the forest clearing its throat, branches breaking in rhythm, the rustle of leaves too heavy to be wind. Something was pacing us, parallel to our path, keeping perfect distance. I counted at least 3, maybe 4 separate sources of movement, always staying just out of sight. Occasionally, a deep grunt echoed through the trees, answered moments later from another direction. It was communication, low-frequency signals rolling through the woods like underground thunder. Every so often I glanced back, expecting to see dark shapes moving between the trunks, but there was nothing visible. Still, the air carried pressure, a vibration I could feel in my teeth. It was like being watched by the forest itself. We kept moving, our progress slow, cautious. The mud clung to our boots, and the weight of fear made every step heavier. At one point we came across a tree, a massive pine, easily 4 feet thick, snapped clean in half about 10 feet from the ground. Not uprooted, snapped. The exposed wood was fresh, the scent of resin still bleeding into the air. Something had done that in the last few hours. By the time we reached the ridge overlooking the trail where we'd first been dropped off, we were all drenched in sweat, even in the cold. The truck wasn't there, just tire marks and emptiness. The radio crackled when the old ranger tried to reach command. Only static, followed by faint distortions, like a voice speaking too far below hearing range. We waited. 3 hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the fog into a pale haze. Then, faintly, from the distance behind us came that same roar we'd heard when the trap was triggered. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Other voices joined it. A chorus of rage rising through the forest, layered, echoing, spreading. Everyone froze. It didn't sound like hunting. It sounded like mourning. The man in the suit arrived shortly after, in another black SUV identical to the first. He looked worse than before. Ashen, eyes sunken, hands trembling so badly that when he lit a cigarette, he burned his thumb without reacting. He didn't ask about the mission. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. He just told us to get in. The drive back was silent. The forest thinned, but the feeling of being followed never did. Once, I looked out the back window and saw movement far behind us. A dark figure standing at the edge of the road, perfectly still, like a statue carved from the trees. I blinked, and it was gone. When we reached the ranger station, everything changed. We were separated immediately, escorted to different rooms that smelled of disinfectant and fear. The men who came to question us weren't from the Park Service. Their suits were gray, their faces clean, their eyes mechanical. They didn't introduce themselves. They asked the same questions in different orders, over and over, testing for inconsistencies. Describe the creature. How tall was it? How did it move? Did it vocalize in any recognizable pattern? Did you notice intelligence? Did it appear to communicate with others? They took notes without looking up. The room had no clock, no windows. Hours passed in dislocated fragments. When I hesitated, they repeated the question, exactly the same words, exactly the same tone, as if reading from a script. At one point, one of them said, "What you encountered is classified under Wildlife Containment Protocol Section 9. You will not discuss it with anyone." I asked what that meant. He stared at me for several seconds, expression empty, then said softly, "It means you were never there. They made me sign papers, non-disclosures, government forms, pages of legal labyrinths that all said the same thing. I'd seen nothing. If I spoke, there would be consequences. They didn't need to elaborate. When I was finally released, the sun was setting. My legs felt hollow. The others were gone, already dismissed or transferred. My supervisor's office was locked, his nameplate removed. By the next morning, his records had vanished from the system as if he'd never worked there. 2 weeks later, I received a new assignment in a different district, hundreds of miles away. My personnel file listed that same week as routine field survey. I was given 2 weeks paid leave, a new badge, and a phone number I was told never to call unless something similar happened again. But the strangest thing wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't. They didn't deny it. They didn't say we were mistaken. They just erased it. That silence said more than any admission could. Months passed, and life returned to its dull rhythm. But at night sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that forest again. The way the fog curled between the trunks. How the air felt thick with awareness. I hear the rattle of chains, the echo of that scream twisting through the dark, and sometimes, when the wind moves just right through the pines near my house, it mimics that same low vibration, the one that doesn't quite sound like wind. I told myself it was memory. I told myself it was trauma replaying itself. But last winter, I heard about another disappearance. A hunter, maybe 50 miles from where we were. They said they found his rifle snapped in two and his tent ripped apart. No tracks, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just the same impossible quiet. And 2 weeks after that, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside my cabin. Not loud, not violent, just deliberate. A single knock on the wood, then another, then silence. I stood by the window, gun in hand, staring into the darkness. The snow reflected just enough light to see the tree line. There, maybe 50 yards out, something was standing between the trees. Too tall for a man. Too still for an animal. It didn't move. It didn't need to. It knew I saw it, and after a long moment that stretched into eternity, it turned, slow, effortless, and melted back into the forest. By morning, the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. And yet I knew it had been there. I could still smell the faint trace of wet fur and earth on the cold morning air. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. Because I finally understood something that no official report, no government order could ever admit. We were never meant to find them. They weren't hiding from us. We were trespassing on their world, and that world doesn't forgive intrusion. 3 years have passed since that expedition, yet it still feels like it never ended. Like part of me is still out there among those black trees, waiting for dawn that never comes. I've changed districts twice since then. New uniforms, new forests, new names on the logs. But the woods all breathe the same way at night. The same uneasy rhythm. The same hidden pulse that sometimes syncs with my own heartbeat, as if the ground itself remembers me. Most nights I manage to convince myself it's over, that whatever we unleashed or disturbed is long gone. But then the forest falls silent in that particular way again. And I know, silence, true silence, has weight. It presses on your skin like water at depth, like the earth itself wants to pull you closer. That silence always means they're near. The last real contact I had with anyone from that mission was nearly a year ago. The oldest ranger, the one who led us, called me out of nowhere. His voice shook, not with age, but with something he couldn't name. He said, "They came back." Then the line cut out. I called back a dozen times, but his number was disconnected. A week later, I learned he'd resigned suddenly, left his house, and vanished. No forwarding address, no trail. Just gone. I tried to bury it, to keep my life small. I stopped going deep into the backcountry alone. I stayed near roads, campgrounds, the sound of engines and people, but fate doesn't care for boundaries. Last autumn, a storm swept through one of my new patrol areas. Power lines down, roads flooded. I volunteered to check the remote cabins after it passed. I told myself it was just duty, but part of me wanted to see if the forest there still felt alive. The first few cabins were fine. Broken windows, fallen branches, nothing more. But at the third one, a small hunting lodge halfway up the ridge, the door was hanging off its hinges. Inside, furniture was overturned, clawed, smashed. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, untouched by rot even after days. Outside, behind the cabin, I found the tracks. Huge. Deep. Too defined to be washed out by rain. They circled the cabin twice, then stopped right at the back door, facing it. Whatever made them had stood there for a long time, waiting. There was a mark on the wall near the doorframe. A single handprint pressed into the wood. Enormous, the fingers wider than my wrist. The wood beneath it was warped, compressed, as if it had been pressed with a pressure beyond human strength. The rain hadn't washed it away. That night, I stayed in the ranger outpost instead of going home. Couldn't sleep. Around midnight, the lights flickered, the generator coughed, and the radio, an old analog unit, came alive for the first time in years. The signal was faint, buried in static, but I swear I heard voices. Deep, guttural syllables spaced by long pauses, almost rhythmic. Like the communication we heard in the forest that night. Only now it was carried on the airwaves, crawling through the static as if searching. I shut the radio off, but the sound didn't stop. It lingered, faintly, vibrating through the walls like something humming beneath the foundation. I sat there in the dark, staring at the window, knowing that glass and distance meant nothing. The next morning, I hiked up to the ridge again, telling myself I needed to confirm the tracks were real, to photograph them for the record. But when I reached the cabin, the ground was bare. The handprint on the wall was gone. Every trace of what I'd seen had vanished. Only the trees remained. still ancient, unbothered. But as I stood there trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, I noticed something hanging from a low branch near the trail. A piece of cloth. Torn, frayed, gray from age. I knew that material. Government issue, from the same uniforms we wore 3 years ago. And it wasn't weathered enough to have been there long. That was the first night the dreams started again. The same ones I thought I'd escaped. The sound of chains dragging through soil. The glow of eyes just beyond firelight. The sensation of being studied, catalogued, understood, and found wanting. In the dream, the cage door never holds. The metal buckles. The forest leans inward, as if eager to reclaim what we took. And every time I wake, the sound of the wind outside my cabin isn't quite wind. It's breath. A few weeks ago, a memo circulated through our regional network. Another ranger team had gone missing 2 states north. Official report said vehicle accident during flood conditions. But there were no tire marks, no debris, no recovered equipment, only their radio, found in a creek bed miles away. Its last transmission was one line of garbled audio. They're not supposed to be here. That same night, I received an unmarked envelope on my porch. No postage, no handwriting. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white. It showed a clearing in dense forest, with a shape standing at its center. Broad shoulders, thick arms. A silhouette that blurred at the edges as if it was half in shadow, half in light. On the back, written in pencil, were 3 words. It remembers you. I burned the photo, but the image stayed. Not on paper, in my mind. Like a brand. Some nights now, when I drive the back roads after dark, my headlights catch things they shouldn't. Shapes that retreat too quickly into the trees. Eyes that flash once and vanish. A few times I've found rocks laid out across the road in careful patterns. Circles, triangles, symbols I've seen before carved into stone. When I move them, they return the next day. The agency pretends none of this is happening. The reports disappear. The files get reassigned. They call it environmental interference, equipment malfunction, false witness recollection. But I know the truth. The same truth I've carried alone for 3 years. Those creatures didn't vanish. They adapted. They learned. They watched us set our traps, test our weapons, measure their strength. And they've been watching ever since. They've seen how we record, how we hunt, how we erase. And they understand something fundamental about us now. That we're arrogant enough to believe the wild is still ours. I sometimes wonder what will happen when that illusion finally breaks. When one of them steps out of the tree line not to hide, not to defend, but to speak. What language would that moment sound like? A growl, a scream, or something closer to a mirror held up to us, showing what we once were, and what we might become again if the world decided to forget us. Last night, just before dawn, I heard the same deep hum outside my cabin. Not near, beneath. The ground itself thrummed, gentle but constant, like the earth breathing. I stepped out barefoot, the cold biting at my skin. The fog moved slowly between the trees, and somewhere in that white curtain, a shape stood still. Watching. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. I could feel it in my chest, in my bones, in the way the night seemed to hesitate around us. Then after a long moment it turned away, disappearing back into the mist. And then faintly, from the darkness came a sound that almost resembled a voice. Low, broken, distant, speaking a pattern I couldn't decipher but could somehow understand. It wasn't anger this time. It was recognition, a warning, a promise, that the forest remembers. That it never forgets those who tried to cage what cannot be caged. And somewhere deep beneath the soil and stone where light doesn't reach, something ancient has decided to start watching again. I keep the lights off at night now. It feels safer that way. Not because I'm hiding, but because sometimes, when the glass catches the reflection just right, I see something behind me, and I know that if I ever turn fast enough to face it, I won't come back from what's looking back at me. There are nights now when I can't tell if I'm awake or dreaming. When the lines between the forest and the world I once knew blur like water over ink. Sleep doesn't come naturally anymore. It creeps in short bursts, fractured by the same sound. That slow, steady rhythm beneath the ground, like something ancient shifting in its sleep. I moved last winter, miles away from any national park, to a small cabin near the edge of a quiet town. I told myself distance would matter, that asphalt and streetlights would be enough to keep whatever it was at bay. But you can't move away from memory. You can't move away from the soil that remembers your name. It started again about a month after I settled in. A series of small things at first. The porch light flickering at exactly 3:17 every morning. The motion sensor by the shed turning on with no wind, no animals. One night I found the door slightly ajar, and hanging from the knob was a piece of twine tied into a loop. The kind we used to rig the perimeter alarms in that cursed forest. I stared at it for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold, then burned it in the sink. But when I stepped outside an hour later, another was hanging there. The knot tighter, neater. The next day I drove into town and bought new locks, stronger ones. I even had a priest bless the cabin, though I didn't tell him why. He sprinkled the water, muttered his Latin, and smiled at me in that polite, distant way. But when he turned to leave, I saw his hands tremble. "This ground," he said softly, "it feels unclean. The forest begins just past my property line. I used to think of trees as comfort, symbols of peace, life, renewal. But these ones are wrong. They stand too straight, too still, as if they're listening instead of growing. Sometimes at dawn I walk out to the edge, look between the trunks, and swear I see impressions in the soil. Too wide, too deep. Human, but not last week something changed. I woke around midnight to the faint echo of a knock. Not on the door this time, but under the floorboards. A single deliberate tap, then another, slower. The pattern was the same as before, the one we heard through the forest radio years ago. The same rhythm the creatures used to speak. I sat there in the dark, the air pressing on me, listening to that sound crawl through the wood and vanish into silence. The next morning, I dug beneath the cabin. I don't know why. Maybe to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The soil was damp and cold, the smell thick and earthy. A few inches down, my shovel hit something hard. For a second I thought it was stone, but when I brushed the dirt away, I saw metal. Rusted, curved, heavy. I pulled it free. It was one of the same steel stakes we used to anchor those giant traps. The kind that should have been buried hundreds of miles away. The kind that should have never left that forest. I dropped it instantly, heart racing, and stepped back. The ground beneath where it had been seemed darker, as if the soil itself had been burned. I filled the hole and walked away, but later, when I came back, the dirt was smooth, untouched. No sign I'd ever dug there. That evening, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man's voice, low and calm, said, "You need to stop digging." Before I could speak, the line went dead. I tried to trace it. It didn't exist. 2 days later, I drove to the nearest ranger outpost. Not mine, but one far enough that no one would know me. I needed to talk to someone who might understand. The officer behind the desk listened quietly as I described what happened, then interrupted me halfway through. "You shouldn't be here," he said, eyes darting toward the hallway. "They'll come if you talk about it." When I asked who, he didn't answer. He just slid a small envelope across the counter. "For your own safety, burn it without opening." I didn't listen. I opened it in my truck. Inside was a single photograph, newer, clearer than the one I burned years ago. The same clearing, the same shadowed figure. But this time there were two, one towering behind the other. And in the foreground, half buried in the mud, was a metal tag with a number I recognized. It was my old ranger ID. That night the forest came alive again. It started with distant thuds, like footsteps too far to hear properly but heavy enough to feel. Then came the smell, musk and wet iron, thick and suffocating, carried on wind that shouldn't have been blowing. My cabin windows rattled once, then went still. When I stepped outside, the air was moving strangely, as if everything around me was breathing in unison. The trees swayed without sound. Somewhere in the dark, something exhaled. Slow, deep, deliberate. I shined my flashlight toward the sound. For a heartbeat, I saw them. Two massive silhouettes standing at the edge of the property line, not moving, watching. The beam hit their faces for less than a second before they turned, melting back into the mist. But I caught one detail. Eyes that reflected red like coals. Not from fear, not from surprise, but from recognition. The next morning, I found tracks in the frost, leading right up to my porch, stopping just before the first step. Alongside them, half pressed into the earth, was a handprint. The same as before, the same impossible size. I don't go out at night anymore. I keep my windows covered. But it doesn't matter. I hear them in the distance sometimes. Not screams, not roars, but a low cadence of communication, rolling through the trees like thunder under skin. It feels like they're waiting, not to attack, not to hide, to decide. Sometimes I think about that creature we caught, the one we left behind in the cage. I wonder if it's still alive. If it remembers me, maybe that's why they follow. Maybe they don't want revenge. Maybe they just want what was taken, not a body but a secret, a silence, a truth we were never meant to carry. Because what if that wasn't the first time they'd been captured? What if this has happened again and again, generation after generation, each time ending the same way, with men like me swearing to forget, and forests like that one waiting for us to break the promise? I've started recording these words, not to warn anyone, but because I can feel it closing in again. I don't know if it's guilt or gravity, but something's pulling me back to where it began. The dreams now show me the path, the broken road, the ridge, the clearing. I see the cage again, but it's empty this time. Open. The chains are gone. And every night the same voice whispers through the dark, not in words, but in rhythm. The same 3 beats, the same breath between them, the same message. We are still here, and this time, we remember you.